Dr. Elna Moolman, an economist at Standard Bank, joins me live now. Thanks so much for your time on SABC News. So we're puttering along at an expected 1.8% growth for 2022. What can we expect the president to say come 7 p.m. tonight about our economy?
Good afternoon. So my expectation will be that we'll focus on two aspects of the growth trajectory. Firstly, he'll talk about the growth rate. You've mentioned nearly 2%. And of course, he might put that in the context of about 1% that we had prior to the pandemic. So stress the improvement. And he'll probably claim some credit for that, given the support that we had from government in the form of fiscal support. And then, of course, we also had monetary policy support with very low interest rates. And then I think that the second aspect that he'll emphasize is the support given specifically to the poor. And of course, there were two big ways in which government provided direct support to the poor. The one was extensive social grants, and the other was a program that we're very excited about, the Presidential Employment Program. So I think the focus is going to be on these two aspects of the growth trajectory. He might also emphasize that towards the middle of this year, we could be back at our real level of pre-pandemic GDP. And that's a lot better than the original expectation. So originally, everybody thought we would only get there again by 2023. So it still means that we've only gotten back to where we were before, but at least it's a little earlier than we thought. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Moolman, we know that when it comes to our economy, the real detail is going to come out when we see budget on the 23rd. But when it comes to pressures facing the South African economy, is there anything that the president should specifically touch on tonight?
I think to some extent you've mentioned the budget, and this does set the scene. He is not going to give us any specifics related to fiscal policy. I think there are two very important messages that he needs to give tonight, either directly or indirectly. The first is government's approach to the fiscal stance. In other words, he needs to ensure us that in as much as they have sympathy for the poor, would like to provide whatever support they can to the poor, that they will only do that to the extent that we can afford it. In other words, they have now been promising for some time that we are on this path of fiscal consolidation, in other words, moving towards a more sustainable fiscal stance. And he needs to assure us tonight that whatever they do will still be within that framework. We will only stay within our means. And I think the second theme that will feature in this regard is the support from the private sector. Again, this is something that's been quite clear throughout President Ramaphosa's term so far, and that is an increased role of the private sector. And again, it comes back to the idea that from a fiscal perspective, we're really very constrained. We would like to invest in infrastructure, etc., but we just don't always have that fiscal space. And government has been creating a lot of additional room for the private sector to support it. And of course, it started mainly in the energy sector, where we had massive reforms last year, and will now probably also move into the transport sector as well.
All right, so Dr. Moolman, you spoke about infrastructure. They're part of the South African Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan is aggressive investment in infrastructure, also taking a look at our energy, economic and other macroeconomic interventions rather. How much of a report back should we expect tonight on the details outlined in the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan?
Absolutely. I think it's going to feature very prominently. And I would like to maybe focus on two themes. The one is we've both mentioned energy. So we've had these policy changes last year. And I'd expect the president to talk a lot about that and about the plans of the companies. When we talk to companies, we can certainly hear them taking advantage of the new regulations around embedded generation, and we'd expect, many plans to be announced over the course of the year, and we'll probably start seeing some spending taking place from the end of the year and into next year. And then the second theme is around real investments. And there I'd say there are two sets of investments. So the one would be infrastructure, specifically private-public partnerships. And we think here of the gazetted infrastructure projects. And there we're quite optimistic that he'll be able to tell us a lot about the progress made thus far. What would be very interesting then is also to hear about the private sector investment projects. You will recall all of those investment conferences that we've had since 2018. And it would be very useful if now we can get an update of how many of those projects have been completed, or they're still on track, or have some of them perhaps been cancelled as a result of COVID and the impact thereof on the economy.
Dr. Moolman, as we wrap, when it comes to structural and regulatory reform, what, if anything, can we expect to hear from the State of the Nation address?
I think this year should assume that government's focus really on implementation at this stage. So we shouldn't wait for new big projects to be announced and new plans and new approaches. We know what needs to be done. We now need to focus on implementation. And I think we're going to hear a lot about Operation Vulindlela, which is that operating or implementation unit between the presidency and Treasury. And I have to say, so far, there has been a lot of progress. They are, of course, only focused on a specific set of priority interventions and only focused on getting this implemented. So my expectation would be no real new plans, but some progress report on what has been done, and then maybe an indication of what we can expect over the next year. I'd say we've spoken about energy and infrastructure more generally, and perhaps the focus will now shift to the logistical sector and the transportation sector, where we know there are real bottlenecks. And we've heard of a couple of promises and interventions, and again, Vulindlela has a list of priorities that they focused on, but it would be interesting to see if this year we can get some progress there that could potentially mean a lot from a trend growth perspective.
Dr. Elna Moolman, an economist at Standard Bank, thanks so much for your time and insight tonight. As we take a look ahead to the State of the Nation address, we expect President Cyril Ramaphosa to deliver that at 7 p.m. tonight.